late, as I was saying, so we probably will have some stragglers coming into the room as well. That was me also buying some time, and I will get started now. So our topic today you can see on the screen. So it's the implementation of Indigenous data sovereignty and research. And I told Blaine that I just wanted to make a quick comment before he started. Blaine will acknowledge the land that we're on. The comment is just that this is an incredibly important topic. When I reflect on the importance of research to advance our knowledge about how best to provide care, how best to understand both health and disease. The research is only applicable if your populations are part of that research. And we know this across the board, right? So understanding how to ensure that Indigenous people can be part of research is really only possible by addressing this issue. So I wanted to start with that comment. When I saw the topic coming up, I was like, okay, this is a must see, must attend, and I'm really looking forward to the presentation. So Blaine Wolfe is the engagement co-lead for the Anishinaabe Gegi, okay. I was looking at that one. I meant to ask you before. So the Anishinaabe team and a proud member of the Curve Lake First Nation. He has a BA in psychology and an ECE diploma, as well as numerous awards for his work in childcare. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Blaine.
Oh, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I just want to have share Sarah Cloud Romeo's regrets. She was hoping to come in today, but she's ill. She is a med student who works on our team and has really been a huge part of this work and helping me to develop a new idea called the Sacred Stewardship Collective, which is going to be a name you're going to be seeing throughout the presentation that we're going to address at the end. So today we're going to be talking about the implementation of Indigenous data sovereignty in research, wise practices, and the G-AIMS quality assessment tool. Before I jump into the learning objectives, though, I do want to do a quick land acknowledgement. As we know, CHEO, the CHEO-RI, and my contractor, Kai-Hai, are all on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin Anishinaabe have been stewards of this land for time immemorial. And they are represented by the communities of Pikwakanagan and Kitagan-Zibi locally. So I just want to thank that. And even as an Indigenous person myself, my community is Curve Lake, which is down Toronto way. So I'm also a visitor in this space. So our learning objectives today, we're going to define Indigenous data sovereignty and its relevance to healthcare. We're going to explore how shifts in authority have shaped current data systems and how the G-AIMS tool can help reassert that authority over data systems. We're going to identify principles that support ethical, community-led research. This is through our wise practices that we've developed. We're going to consider how data practice can better honor Indigenous communities, and this is going to be a merger of the two. For that, though, however, I do want to do a quick feather teaching for the folks in the room. Or in online, the room can see me. I have brought two of my feathers that are upside down. That's okay. I have two feathers here. One is a guiding feather. One is a feather that keeps us aloft. Today I'm going to use our guiding feather. And I received this feather when I was a preschool teacher, when I was an early childhood educator, working with Indigenous children at the Makansag Aboriginal Head Start. I was given it by a local elder who came in to our program during Remembrance Day ceremonies. He was a veteran. And one day while I was in the preschool with the kindergarten room with 5 rambunctious boys, he said, Blaine, I want to give you something. And he proceeded to pull out this magnificent feather. And he began to tell me that, Blaine, you are somebody who brings our knowledge and our wisdom to the children who are coming up next. For that makes you a warrior. That's something he says. That's still a title that I'm growing into. But additionally, on that day, I received a teaching, and it was from a non-Indigenous staff member on our team who really connected with our culture, both through his wife an Ojibwe woman, and through working with our program for decades. It gave me a teaching that has just stuck with me for well, decades now. And it goes a little something like this, as they say. So a feather is a beautiful thing, and it's uniform, straight. It's looks like it's designed to never fail. And yet, just like life, uh, things can happen. Strands can break. There can be disruptions in how things look to the point where things look like they could never be fixed again. And he shared, and I believe, that with prayer, a little effort, with determination, there we go. We can put things back together again. And I really believe that this is a big part of why I do this work and why we all do this work, is that we know that we exist within a system that has broken my people, that has disrupted our ways of life, but that through intention, prayer, and really, really addressing the inherent needs of our people, we can really make things better again. It may not look exactly like how it was. This strand wants to come loose still. There we go. But we can get it to the point where it can keep us aloft, can guide us again. So I want to thank Fern for that teaching, gave it to me back then. They're one spirit, one song. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about why I'm here. So I was contracted by the Canadian Institute for Health Information to develop their Indigenous data governance framework. What they asked of me was to create something that could help improve the quality of healthcare using the data, the mountains of data that is contained within healthcare, within the CHEO data holding. It's critical. We know that healthcare discrepancies between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations is huge. And one of the ways that we can manage that is by accessing healthcare or accessing healthcare data to address those needs. However, the data at CHEO is not easily accessible without governance. And this is because we need to make sure that that data isn't so easy that there could be people out there who would misuse it. So they needed a pragmatic Indigenous data governance framework to provide that access. And that's what we've been doing for the last year. I call this phase one of this project. There are two more phases, which I'll talk about later. But what I'm going to share with you is the culmination of our phase one work. So, a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about, the Indigenous data governance for CHEO. We're going to talk about the GAIMS QAT. GAIMS, you're going to see this acronym a bunch. It stands for Governance, Access, Management, Equity, Storage, Quality Assessment Tool. And then we're also going to talk about 7 wise practices for safer research with Indigenous communities. Oftentimes, researchers go to a community and not really know where to start in regards to building relationships. So we were made sure to highlight those things that researchers could do better or incorporate into their practice to, build better relationships. So the way that we did this was through two methods or two branches of our data gathering. One was a scoping review. We call this the implementation of Indigenous data sovereignty in health research in North America, Turtle Island, and Australasia. We wanted to highlight and gather information on Indigenous data sovereignty implementation across countries and nations that had similar colonial histories as Canada. This is why we chose Australasia and North America. This is a literature mapping exercise where we analyze themes, and I've helped identify gaps within the system where people weren't talking about how they were implementing Indigenous data sovereignty within their research, even if they were. Additionally, because I love talking, we also had three amazing qualitative data gathering methods. These were 2 talking circles, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, a researcher interviews, and a national summit, an Indigenous data governance and sovereignty summit that brought together researchers and folks in quality improvement from across Canada. It was a 40-person summit. Kristen Osmond was there. Shout out. And it was an amazing opportunity to come together, talk about each other's work, because oftentimes folks working in this space are working in silos. That's obviously a reality of working in a big country, but it's also a reality in that historically we've been our systems and our processes have been designed to separate us, and us coming together is really pushing them back against those systems, and offering us a chance to connect in ways that we haven't before. So a little bit about our scoping review. It started off as GMs. Equity didn't come until later. So the way that we developed our search strategy was by highlighting 4 key principles that Indigenous data sovereignty constantly addressed. This was governance, essentially the governance of or what governance structure a particular research study was implementing. Access, how Indigenous data was accessed. This was both how research was designed, its methodology, but also the consent that was received from communities to access their data, their secondary data. Additionally, we looked at the management structures within Indigenous data sovereignty that governed how individual workers managed the data. The individual IT workers, researchers, research assistants, how were they trained in Indigenous data sovereignty paradigms while they were engaging with Indigenous communities. And then finally, storage. We wanted to know where and how people were talking about and locating their data once it was gathered from Indigenous communities. So the model conceptualizes Indigenous data sovereignty in 2 ways. One is governance, Indigenous created governance, it should be highlighted. When we're talking about Indigenous data sovereignty, Indigenous data, these principles and protocols should only be created by Indigenous communities. And then finally, AMS. AMS refers to the infrastructure needed to support the implementation of Indigenous data sovereignty. Without that infrastructure, oftentimes we're only speaking about Indigenous data sovereignty without actually actualizing it. It's been forever since I've used paper for notes, so I'm just going to toss it right there if you don't mind. It's on the floor, folks. So, the scoping review. As I was saying, it included Indigenous populations with a similar colonial history of Canada. And what we developed was a novel search strategy based on GMs. It included the high-level names of Indigenous populations, health. It included articles from 2004 to 2005. 2004 because this was the publication date of Schnark, who published OCAP with FNIGC. And what we were able to gather was over 400 articles that touched on what we were looking for. However, after screening, we were only able to use about 11 or 12 articles to actually include into our extraction. This was somewhat shocking, considering how much Indigenous data or how much Indigenous research was happening out in the world. But as we came to realize, while there was a lot of Indigenous research happening, people weren't talking about how they were implementing Indigenous data sovereignty within their research. And for extraction, to really highlight how people were talking, we used an oral tradition methodology. What we did was we found how people were talking within their articles and highlighted the keywords within those articles to create a heat map of that information. I'm going to jump to that heat map in a bit, but I want to talk about our work sequentially. After or during this time while we were writing our scoping review, we also were having our talking circles. These talking circles included organizations such as FNIGC, that's the First Nations Information Governance Center, FNHA, the First Nations Health Authority out of BC, CHEO, ICES, I cannot remember what ICES stands for, Born Ontario, the Martin Family Initiative, MFI, an organization that stores a lot of visual data, non-Indigenous organization, so I had a lot of interest in learning about this. And what we came up with were, from those talking circles, were 7 wise practices for engaging with Indigenous communities. Additionally, we held researcher interviews or interviews with folks who have worked with Indigenous communities. We spoke with Dr. Carolyn Melro, who works here at the RI, where we learned about the importance of working in a good way in community. We talked to Dr. Nancy Young, who is actually my boss at the Anishinaabe, the Children's Health and Wellbeing Measure, where she reminded us that when we're working with community, we need to go at the pace of trust. And finally, we talked with Dr. Alex Pedequan, medical doctor, who really highlighted the need to ground our work in equity and justice. Because we're talking about Indigenous data in non-Indigenous spaces, we need to make sure that we are grounding our work in addressing the need for these spaces to include equity within what we're measuring. And this is why we moved from GAMs to GAIMs. We wanted to make sure that we were highlighting that equity piece. And what's neat is that, I think it's neat. What's neat is that GAIMs is kind of meant to be like an equation. So we have G there at the end separated from the AMS. This is separating the governance from the infrastructure. And then in the brackets there, we have the equity. Because in non-Indigenous spaces, we want to make sure that we're starting with the equity before we start talking about the infrastructure needed. Because without good equity, the infrastructure is influenced by that inequity. This is the heat map of the articles that were gathered. As you can see, there weren't a lot of articles. Out of the over 400 that we gathered, we only had 11 here. And primarily, people spoke to their governance strategies. This means that they often talked about OCAP, maybe the IQ principles, but they didn't highlight how that data was accessed once it was, let me move my cursor out of the way. They didn't highlight how that data was accessed, the management structures that were in place by the workers who were handling that data. And except for one article, they rarely spoke about the story where that data was stored once it was collected. Article 54 there is a really exemplary example of great Indigenous research. This is actually done by Dr. Nadine Carone for the IBVL. I don't know why I have a slide for this. I'll tell you in a sec. But it was specifically about a biobank, and that's why storage was spoken about so much. We're good. Here we are. So these are two amazing articles and projects. Just a moment.
Here. Code red. Room 11. Do not use the elevators until further notice. Your attention, please. Code red.
Thank you for your patience, everybody.
Room 11. Do not use elevators until further notice.
Probably have a few words.
Oh, it's in French.
Salle 11. Pas des ascenseurs jusqu'à nouvel ordre. Votre attention, s'il vous plaît. Code rouge. 6F, salle 11. N'utilisez pas les ascenseurs jusqu'à nouvel ordre.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. So as I was saying, we have two articles here that really highlights amazing Indigenous partnerships. The first is by Dr. Nadine Carone's team, where they were helping to create what's called the Indigenous Biovariance Library. The project itself was called the Silent Genomes Project, and it's highlighted the need of creating a repository for Indigenous biodata. Because as we know, especially for precision health, having access to that biodata is incredibly important for tracking genetic diseases and what have you. But oftentimes, it is hard to find those genetic diseases and biomarkers within Indigenous populations. Additionally, we have the Our Health Counts project. This was by Dr. Janet Smiley. This is an important and impactful work that created First Nations linkages to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis linkages to health data. All clear. Probably in French. No. Okay. Creating linkages. As we know. Because this presentation's fine. Okay, so The second project there, Our Health Counts, looked to create linkages between First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people to their data within the healthcare system. This is incredibly important work because it required partnerships, coordination, and communication with those communities to build those linkages in safe, respectful, and co-developed ways. This was done in places like Hamilton, Toronto, and Thunder Bay, including others. But we're finally going to get into the GAIMS quality assessment tool phase 1. So as I was saying, this QAT will provide CHEO the means and other organizations to measure the implementation of Indigenous data sovereignty principles in research and quality improvement initiatives to better assess the ability of these partners to properly respect the need to use Indigenous data safely while conducting research and/or quality improvement activities. This tool will be able to respect the diverse nature of Indigenous communities and their policies. It's not a tool that will create a new governance framework, but a tool that will measure existing frameworks so that we aren't stepping over Indigenous communities and creating something that they didn't create themselves. Because Indigenous data sovereignty principles are meant to be asserted by nations, and our job is to respect it as non-Indigenous organizations. Additionally, this tool will highlight the gaps within the system that make respecting Indigenous data sovereignty harder to actualize due to the inability of institutions to address their equity issues or the inability to properly actualize Indigenous data sovereignty based on a lack of infrastructure within those institutions. To begin with, when we're talking about governance, it refers to Indigenous created data sovereignty principles and governance that a particular organization, researcher, or institute is respecting. By governance, we're referring to relational and engagement-based policies and frameworks, the Indigenous advisory councils and governance bodies that exist. This can be things like ITK, tribal councils, the honoraria given and respectful engagement practices that a particular organization employs, and of course, the Indigenous data sovereignty frameworks that a particular organization uses. Things like OCAP, the IQ principles that the Inuit use, and OCAS, that stands for ownership, control, access, and stewardship, by the way. And that's the Métis principles. And it's important to remember that when we're working with Indigenous data sovereignty take priority over institutional policies and processes, not including privacy and data protection laws, of course. As a brief refresher, even though I'm sure who's taken OCAP? Gosh, you guys. Well, I'm going to implore y'all to take OCAP. It is a good foundation to start thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty and how to implement it within your research. So OCAP stands for ownership, control, access, and possession. And these are data sovereignty principles that are specific to First Nations communities, but could be used by Inuit and Métis communities as well. It's important to remember that we don't want to pan-Indigenize Indigenous data sovereignty, and that each individual community has the right to assert whatever data sovereignty principles they want to for their community, whether that's something that's already created or something that they've created themselves. And there's a lot of really neat community-based Indigenous data sovereignty principles that are starting to come up. So be aware of that. So ownership means First Nations community own their data. This is prior to collection. Control refers to communities determine how data is collected, used, and shared. Access refers to communities' right to have access to decide who can access their data, both their primary and secondary data. It's always important to remember that we're talking about secondary data too. And the possession. Communities have the right to store their physical data or store their data physically, or if they cannot, be honored by incorporating data stewardship agreements within the research lifecycle, so that they're aware that they can access their data even if they can't physically store it. That's harder, obviously, for biodata, but as we can see with the IBVL project with Dr. Nadine Caron, we are coming to a point where biodata can now be stored. And these principles ensure data is used in ways that respect community rights to self-determination and self-governance. Access refers to accessing Indigenous data, or accessing Indigenous data is built through relationships. And this refers to the consent necessary to actually access that data from communities, that secondary data. Additionally, it incorporates the A in OCAP, the how data is initially collected in primary research. Engagement should be relationship driven and reciprocal. Relationships are the primary means, or one of the ideally primary means, through which access is granted from communities. It's important to note that when we're talking about Indigenous communities, we're talking about nation-to-nation relationships. So it's incumbent, it's ideal, I'll keep trying to use the word ideal. It's ideal that larger institutions take the lead in initiating respectful engagement. This is actually something CHEO does pretty well. And it's important to remember that when we're developing relationships, when we're beginning that engagement, that we're positioning ourselves within our own colonial histories, so that we are better positioned to present ourselves well and with transparency. This is both individual as a researcher and also institutionally. You know, for us at the Anishinaabe, the reason why we're here at CHEO is because Sick Kids has a history with colonialism that's a little darker than CHEO's, specifically experimentation on Indigenous children in residential schools. So it's important to note what baggage your particular organization may have when you're approaching communities. And that's not a slight against Sick Kids. They've actually highlighted on their website that history. So they are acknowledging it, and that's important, transparency. So when we're talking about access and looking for consent, we need to make sure that when we're creating our funding protocol or applications, we're including engagement activities, honoraria, community visits into our funding applications. So it's not something that we're tagging on at the end or doing off for free. We need to make sure that we're giving back to ourselves and to the community. We want to identify existing governance bodies or community representatives that may be in community. It may not be appropriate to go to chief and council when there might be a research council within. Or it might not be appropriate to go to an individual community when there's a larger tribal council that represents many communities. Understanding the historical relationship with research and healthcare is also important. Just so that we're not re-traumatizing or creating another rough experience by going in without the appropriate information to back us up. When we can, we want to build from existing relationships whenever possible. This is a great way to scaffold our work based on work that's already been done. This includes maintaining relationships over time. It's a great way to do this. And take time to learn the local context before reaching out. You know, you may be very incredibly versed in, say, the Ojibwe Anishinaabe culture, but going into, say, a Mi'kmaq culture, you might think there's similarities, and there might not be. So you want to make sure that you're versed in that individual communities, that individual nations, that individual regions, cultural relationship before you go in. Don't assume nothing. You don't want to pan-indigenize. Management. So this, as I was saying, this stands for the people, the systems, and the process that support how Indigenous data is handled. So this is the infrastructure and personnel responsible for data stewardship, the process that support the secure storage and appropriate access, the policies and procedures guiding data use and its handling, and the practices that respect and uphold Indigenous data within the healthcare system. You want to know how a particular organization is managing the Indigenous data within that organization, not just where it is, but also the people that are managed and the policies that are in place within that particular organization. Equity, incredibly important, as I was saying. This is why it has those brackets. The structure, policies, and culture within a particular organization that should that shape how Indigenous data is approached and used. And things that we're looking for equity are how an organization is committed to cultural safety and anti-colonial practices. This can include things like mandatory training, like TCPS2, the Tri-Council Policy Statement 2, Chapter 9, the Good Clinical Practices document. It can include cultural safety programs like Sanyas or the blanket exercise. And it's an institutional reflection on historical relation, or it's recognizing the institutional relationships of historical relationships with Indigenous communities, as I was saying earlier. The workforce culture that supports safety, accountability, and retention. Oftentimes, high turnover of Indigenous staff is a sign that a particular culture within an organization is not safe for those people. So it might not be a safe place to store data. And that organizational commitment of resources to uphold governance and leadership support. So is a particular organization able to provide resources to community or to leaders within that community so that they can gain access to the things that oftentimes we take for granted. An organizational culture is reflected in who stays, who leaves, and who feels safe to engage. We need to make sure that a place like CHEO is a place where we're free to talk and express ourselves in ways that feel culturally safe, where we feel heard. Yeah, period, exclamation point. So finally, storage is the physical and virtual environments where Indigenous data is stored and protected. And here we have a hierarchy of safety. Obviously, data stored within Indigenous controlled infrastructure, a sovereign data server on sovereign Indigenous lands, is one of the safest places for Indigenous data to be stored. From there, we go down in safety. Next would be storage of Indigenous data within separate physical systems. So this could be a separate server within a server infrastructure, so it only houses data that's physically separated from mainstream data. We could have storage that is virtually siloed within a virtual environment. This is actually how the Anishinaabe, my program, that collects Indigenous data on behalf of communities. We don't use the data in any way. It's for community use. We represent OCAP, or we follow OCAP. But the data that's collected and stored here at CHEO is siloed virtually within the mainstream system. And then finally, storage within non-segregated systems. And this is specifically the Kaihai reality. Indigenous data right now that's collected across Canada is collected in one place and is not separated physically or virtually from the mainstream data set. So it's a very tough situation, but it's the reason why we're creating this program, this framework. Where data is stored directly impacts the control, access, and sovereignty of that data. There's a point there. Degree of separation from non-Indigenous data. That's what I was saying earlier. So finally, because it looks like I'm doing pretty well on time, actually. Our 7 wise practices for good Indigenous engagement and relationship building. Here we have things like awareness, relationship building, respecting Indigenous leadership, respecting Indigenous data sovereignty, making sure that community benefit is balanced against the risks from engaging in research, empowering community, and making sure that Indigenous communities have access to the knowledge translation activities or access to the creation of those knowledge translation activities. So 1, awareness. Colonial and research-related harms are not historical artifacts. They are constantly happening. And they continue to shape present-day mistrust and reluctance to engage. And this reluctance to engage is often on both sides. Indigenous communities may want to step away from research because they don't trust that research or the research methodology or just the idea of research at all. And researchers may pull away because they may feel like it's too much work or there's too heavy a burden on research to engage in that research. And there's a favorite quote of mine that I've compiled and summarized into something pretty simple. And it's that the harm of inaction is greater than the risk of not getting it perfect or being embarrassed. We need to make sure that we're bridging these 2 parties together, because when we don't, that disparity grows, and it is growing. So as such, awareness is not passive, it's an active activity. We're making sure that through our awareness, we are acting on that awareness. Next is relationship building. As I like to say, relations are the prerequisite, not a byproduct of research. And relationships are the foundation of access, not a step in the process. For key principles with this wise practice is that engagement is relational, not transactional. we're looking at building partnerships with Indigenous communities, not something where we go in, engage for a bit, take, and then leave. We want something that persists over time and sets the stage for future relationships, even not for us, but for future researchers who come after us. Trust is built over time, not requested at entry. As Dr. Nancy was saying, we go at the pace of trust. So oftentimes, research may go a little bit slower than what we would expect usually, but through this time, this is where trust and relationship is built. One of my favorite things to think about is that relationships are really developed well with space and time. This is why developing friendships over Zoom can take very, very long, because we don't have that space to look at each other's body language, smell the smells that are coming off us, and share experiences together in a physical space. This physical space component is incredibly important, both just to relationship building in general, but also to Indigenous communities where we've been doing this relational building style for millennia. Institutions must take responsibility to initiate respectfully. So making sure that we're not all, once we get this GAMS tool, we're all going to community and overburdening them. No, we want to make sure that institutions are taking the lead in that relationship building, and that the individual researchers are checking in with their institutions to make sure that it is the right time to develop those relationships. And as I was saying earlier in the GMs, where appropriate, aim for nation-to-nation engagement, making sure that it's larger organizations engaging with each other where possible and ideally. Community benefit. Oh, that little one is not moving. This is number 3. Community benefit. Research that does not create meaningful equitable benefit risks being extractive. Oftentimes over the years, I've heard that a lot of research is done just for the sake of knowledge creation. This can oftentimes not be enough benefit for a particular community to engage in research. So benefits must be clear, tangible, and defined by the community and translated to the researcher or from the researcher in a way that's understandable and transparent. Risks must be identified, understood, and actively addressed by the researcher. Again, making sure that transparency is key. And the process should be grounded in transparency, if you can imagine, and partnerships. Indigenous leadership. For many communities, based on the historical relationship with colonialism, many Indigenous peoples have not had the same ability to access the opportunities that many of us have. I've happened to grown up in cities, so I'm lucky enough to have had access to many opportunities that some folks in community may not have had. So we need to make sure that when we're going into community, we are inviting Indigenous people into the research process so that we're developing skills, knowledge within community that they may not regularly have access to. Indigenous leadership should be present across all stages of research. This is at the methodology design, recruitment, data collection, knowledge translation. Decision making must be community directed and not researcher driven. As I was saying with that article for Dr. Janet Smiley with Our Health Counts, she has an amazing research paradigm called community activation, where a researcher goes in with a research idea and through dialogue and building relationships, they essentially co-create a research methodology that both addresses the researcher's need to complete their study and a community's inherent need for their own benefit. So they may have things that they just didn't think about that they needed in a particular way, but they were needs that were present. And making sure that leadership is not symbolic, that it's resource supported and sustained. Again, making sure that relationship is maintained over time. Data sovereignty, Indigenous data sovereignty even. So Indigenous data sovereignty is grounded in rights, treaties, and self-determination. Indigenous data sovereignty is created by Indigenous communities, and that data must be governed according to Indigenous laws and protocols. Sovereignty must be operationalized, not acknowledged in principle alone. This is oftentimes a lot of researchers, and we found this in the literature, they'll say they have taken OCAP, but will not really highlight the other ways that they're respecting Indigenous data sovereignty. How are they managing or respecting the right for communities to control? How are they respecting a community's right to access the data once it's created? And how are they able to provide and respect that possession principle, which is often one of the hardest principles within OCAP to actualize. This can often be navigated through stewardship, our data stewardship agreements and policies. This is actually what our program does at the Anishinaabe. We store data on behalf of Indigenous communities, and we give them a data stewardship agreement. This tells them that within clear legal writing, that they have a right to access their data at any point, that regardless of where that data is stored, it is still theirs. We won't have any reason to look at it. And if we're engaging in a research project, we only use that data for the life cycle of that research project, and then we get rid of our access to it. While they still retain access and possession of that data. Communities retain control over access, use, and sharing. This is really, the reason why this is coming up again is because it really must be highlighted twice. Data possession should reflect community ownership and stewardship. Again, stewardship is one way to navigate the possession principle, or rather respect it in a way that is grounded in the reality that many Indigenous communities don't have the ability to store their data because of a lack of physical infrastructure. These systems must be supported by community-directed governance of that data, and control must be structural, not dependent on individual researchers or individual people within a particular community. We need to make sure that turnover is a reality within our systems these days, that once one person goes or one researcher moves on, that the right to control that data maintains over time, and that's through structural policies that can be supported by things like stewardship agreements. Finally, it still says one, because they're all so important. Knowledge translation. Analysis should reflect community knowledge, context, and priorities. One of the things that we really want to address is the need to not reinforce negative stereotypes of Indigenous health within research. And that can be a tough thing to do. But when we talk about addictions and suicides and other things that Indigenous people experience, other harms that Indigenous people experience, at this point in 2026, I'm of the mindset that we can pinpoint where that comes from. It comes from the body's reaction to the history of colonialism. So we want to make sure that when we're engaging in research, we are doing our best to not reinforce deficit-based negative stereotypes of Indigenous health that places the blame on Indigenous peoples for not navigating the system well enough. As I stand here as an Indigenous person in front of you who's navigated the system well. But for every one of me, there's 10 more who didn't make it. Findings must be validated within the community before dissemination. So for those research outputs, we want to make sure before we're publishing them, before we're putting them out in the world, we're running them by community first. Knowledge translation should be accessible, meaningful, and defined again by community. And those outcomes should support community decision-making and benefit. So we want to, again, make sure that the outputs from research are for the benefit of community and can be used by the community. So what is your responsibility as researchers? For starters, responsible does not end at data collection. It extends out to how data is used, shared, and acted upon. So we want to make sure that with our responsibilities, we prioritize community use, access, interpretation before academic or institutional outputs. Highlighted again. We want to ensure that Indigenous partners lead in the dissemination of researchers, and those researchers are in a supporting role. It's a little bit back. That's okay. This means that maybe we invite Indigenous communities to our presentations at conferences, co-presenting with us. We want to translate all our commitments into clear, accountable action. Again, this is through things like transparency, data stewardship agreements. And we want to make sure that we are maintaining relationships and working partnerships over time. Again, either maintaining those relationships for ourselves or maintaining those relationships for researchers who come after us. We're almost done. Look at that. 3 minutes to 10 minutes for questions. I got this. So what comes next? Well, we have phase 2 and 3 of this program. Phase 2 is going to be the development of measurable KPIs for the GM's QIT. I was really influenced and inspired by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander quality assessment tool. It's a literature quality assessment tool that measures how well researchers engage with Indigenous communities. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to create a tool that has a specific percentage output that can actually measure the implementation of Indigenous data sovereignty research. We're going to develop examples for the WISE practices so that researchers have an actual concrete examples of how those WISE practices are engaged in action. We're going to hold 2 more data sovereignty summits, that hopefully will be bigger than the last, and will give folks an opportunity to share and learn. This is a space meant for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers and folks working with Indigenous people to both share and learn from each other. We're going to develop, you're going to have seen a name there, and this is the development of the Sacred Stewardship Collective. This is going to be a team that I'm co-developing with Sarah Collab Romeo to house the information and develop this information that we're creating moving forward. We're going to engage in community validation, relationship building, and engagement over the next year, trying to validate and find gaps within our own model that Indigenous communities will know are there, where we may have a blind side. For phase 3 of this, and that's for 2026-27, for 27-28, we're going to be looking at healthcare system engagement. So actually talking to folks like Vera, like Jason, to talk about how we implement this framework within systems like this. Then we're going to be implementing this tool within healthcare systems. And then, this is my pie in the sky dream that I'm putting there just to set my intention. We're going to have the Sacred Stewardship Collective Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Governance Conference. I'm hoping that this is a Ottawa-based conference that really invites as many people as I can to talk about Indigenous data sovereignty in a good way, in action. And I'm hoping that in 2 years, there'll be even more research that respects Indigenous data sovereignty that we can shout to the moon about. The summit that we just had was only 40 people. I'm hoping to grow that over time. And with that, I do want to say thank you, and miigwech, and Walalin, for your time and listening and learning about what I had to say and what's coming up and what's been developed thus far. So thank you very much. So let me clean up my mess.
I kind of like the paper flying. Yeah, thank you, Blaine, very much. I have a list of questions and comments, but I will pull up the chat. And while I do that, does anyone in the room have any questions that they want to start with?
Comments, curiosities.
Blaine, there's a kind of a logistical question in the chat. Is there a link to these resources that does not require a CHEO login?
I am going to, let's say email me. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and that's how you will not need an email login. Additionally, I'm going to be sharing these slides with Kirsten, and I will be putting all the links and the articles, all the articles that were collected from our scoping review into the notes. So if anybody has any questions after the fact or wants some access to some extra resources or just want to talk, feel free to reach out to me at bwolfe@cheo.on.ca.
Great. I'll start with one of my questions. Um, you talked about the risk of pan-Indigenization a few times, and something that I've been very curious about. I also have been reflecting on the definition of who is Indigenous. There was I listened to the House on the CBC radio on Saturday mornings, and this week's episode really was dealing with the question of 150 years of the Indian Act and that as a colonial tool, but all the issues that that raises in terms of that definition of who is, which is, as you were saying, is perhaps both unclear and needs to be self-defined. And so when I think about the data and understanding who is actually covered under GN or how it will be in data sets like CHEO or ICS, et cetera, I found myself coming back to, okay, who, right? And how do we define that? So I was curious if that's come up in the governance or in the management.
No, thank you for that. So in regards to who, that is a tough question because often, as we know, the Indian Act specifically has articles within it that will slowly decrease the amount of Indigenous people within Canada. You know, there was a time where if a Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she would lose her Indigenous status. And the system was grateful to her. It's like, congratulations, you're not Indian anymore. This obviously we know is a terrible thing and has led to the genocide of our people, if not through directly killing us, then through at least getting rid of our status as Indigenous people. So understanding who Indigenous people are does often start with self-identification. And that needs to be based in trust. A trust that people know who they are, that for the vast majority of people who are claiming Indigenous identity, that it's based in a good spirit and not in a way to game the system, say. And even if that were the case, the way I see it, say if 1 out of every 10 people were claiming falsely about their indigeneity, that shouldn't sour the ability of those other 10 Indigenous people to access care in a good way. But having said that, it is a tricky subject. One of the ways that luckily CHEO is able to navigate that is by not providing any linkages within their data to individual Indigenous peoples. The way that we're able to definitely highlight when an Indigenous person is in the system is through often NIHB access and postal codes. So say a particular researcher wants to access these postal codes, they may, CHEO may say, well, actually that has Oswego in it, just outside of Brantford, Ontario. Have you had relationships with that community? So that's an easy fix or easy addressing of that question. But in regards to like identification, it's almost not a problem right now because there aren't really those linkages to use and connect people to their indigeneity, even if they were to self-identify, because there isn't really a way to self-identify right now. So future problem.
Cool. Yeah, question from Tom Kavesi.
So thank you for what you talk. I really like the fact that you emphasize the relationship building with communities. I think having done this for a long time, the most useful thing I've learned on my journey has been to talk to people. And that's sort of hard because people, you know, you usually talk to strangers, but you have to start doing that. And I think if you're planning to do research with Indigenous communities, learning to talk to everybody. You're flying to some community, whoever's sitting beside, probably those from that community, they know more about than you. Talk to them. I've learned more from sitting on top, big mountain in Thunder Bay, talking to an elder, staying up all night in Kitchenegas in Nunavut, talking to an elder, than you will learn any other way. And one place where I will depend indigenize is all of these communities are hurting. Because they've all been affected by colonization. And I think as a pretty good rule, the more the community has been affected and is hurting, the more it needs research and the harder it is to do there. And working with those barriers becomes really important, but it's really difficult.
Yeah, no,
Blaine, I don't know if there's a way you can summarize what Tom just said. I was like half thinking about turning the computer around. I think to very briefly summarize, Tom brought up the importance of talking to people in community, that recognizing the damage and the history, and the last point. Sorry, I'm now blank on the last point.
And the more damaged the community, the harder it is to work, the more important research is.
And the interrelationship between the two, the more damaged the community, the harder it is to work. So it was really a reflection. But I wonder if you can comment on that theme.
yeah, no, for sure. For starters, yeah, thank you, Tom. Oftentimes when we're talking about engaging with decision makers, we think about, like I said, chief and council, chief, that hierarchy, that is often so important in a lot of Western systems. But when we go into community, as Tom was saying, oftentimes the people that we learn and engage with and will inform our work will be the people that we're sitting beside with, say at the cafeteria table or at the powwow, on the powwow stands. We want to make sure and remember that when we're engaging with community, that we're talking at all levels of, well, we'll even go this way, all levels of people within that community, because everybody in that community is a decision maker within that particular community. As for the harder to research and harder hit communities, the communities that are a lot more impacted by colonialism, what I would suggest, or at least think about, would be the idea of confederations or collections of communities and research. Instead of going to one particular community to engage in research, build a partnership of communities that can, and I believe you do this, Tom, to develop that research relationship so that you're sharing the burden across multiple communities, and not just taxing an under-resourced community.
Great. So we're coming up to time, but I have one other question I still want to ask. At the beginning, you mentioned working with communities globally, and you mentioned Australasia. And I was curious about what lessons both learned, but also kind of applicability back out. And in particular, I was actually thinking of Africa as well and their history of colonialism, and the way the national structures are extremely heterogeneous there, and whether there was any. So kind of two parts of the question.
For the Australasia piece, actually, I'll go back to Tom. There's a very specific research paradigm within Australasia called yarning. It is that understanding that engaging in conversations for the sake of conversation's sake, not for any particular goal, but simply being in space and talking about talking, is an incredibly important part of the research process. Yarning, for anybody who wants to Google that. There are papers on yarning. And as for Africa, we didn't highlight that region, partly due to time, partly due to the complex patchwork of colonial relationships to different European powers that existed there. So it sounds like something I'm going to need to work on in the future, actually. Thank you.
Great answer.
Oh my gosh, let me kick it.
So with that, I think we're right at time. I want to thank you again for an outstanding presentation. Very engaging, and I like the call to action for anyone who hasn't looked at OCAP or learned about it to do that. So thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you.